I'm happy to be here virtually this afternoon. Being on a real in-person book tour at this point, that means I would be on the East Coast as opposed to my standard West Coast. That would mean I'd be losing sleep, going through airports, and on this travel day, I'm sure it would be very challenging because of the problem that one of the major Southwest Airlines is having at this point. They said it was a third-party glitch. What that says to me is it's probably a ransomware issue. Someone asked me the other day if I had Frig, the AI, the pet AI that lives at Stu Ramey's house in the Ellen Reynolds books. If I had Frig for a day, what would I do with her? Well, I would certainly take down the doers of ransomware. But I, there are all kinds of hazards to being on a regular book tour. You are out of your time zone. You're dragging yourself in and out of airports. You're sleeping in strange beds. You're eating at odd hours, and your whole body is out of kilter. And yet you're supposed to be being charming and affable and sensible at the same time. And so it's a little easier to be charming, affable, and sensible when I'm sleeping in my own bed. But what I miss about that, of course, is the interaction with fans. And I really enjoy hearing from my readers. And if you have a question you'd like to ask me and I don't happen to address it, you're more than welcome to send questions to me at my email address. And my email address is posted on my website at that's hard to remember, jajance.com. So, but just sitting here, I was remembering I was on a book tour. I was someplace, I believe in Virginia or Tennessee, and there had been thunderstorms on the East Coast. And so the plane, and I was supposed to come home via Atlanta. So they flew me to Atlanta. The plane, there were weather delays leaving Tennessee, and I got to Atlanta, and my plane was long gone before I ever got there. But there were lots of other people who were stranded too. And they said, oh, when we get there, get on a bus, there'll be a bus and we'll get you to hotels. And so I believed that. But the bus was full and it left without me. So eventually I flagged down, excuse me, I flagged down a Hilton bus. And the bus driver said, the hotel is full. I said, I don't care, take me there anyway. So I got to the hotel and I threw myself on the mercy of the people at the desk. The hotel was fully booked, but they let me sleep on a pull-out cot in the dining room of the presidential suite. But those are some of the hazards that come on real in-person book tours. And so we're missing all that excitement today. First, since I haven't done events in your neck of the woods before, I thought I'd give you a little background on me so you'd know something about the person behind the words. I was born in South Dakota. My mother was from Summit, a little town in northeastern South Dakota. My dad was from Marvin, 10 miles away. They met in the summer of 1935. And according to family legend, my father went to Summit courting my mother's younger sister, Toots. And their father, my grandpa Anderson, always claimed, he said, Norman, in this house, we eat the old bread first, which is how I ended up with my mother being Evie, as opposed to my mother being my Aunt Tooth. They married, they were farming in a little town called Twin Brooks. And in 1948, my father was bedridden with arthritis for 6 months, and the doctor said he needed to move to a high, dry climate. There were 3 kids who were born in South Dakota, my 2 older sisters and me. After we moved to Bisbee, Arizona, which was a high, dry climate, and where, incidentally, my father recovered his health completely, the next 3 kids were born, my 3 brothers and my baby sister, Janie. So my mother always called me the third one of the first batch. Well, between those 2 batches of kids, my 2 sisters, my oldest sisters, Janice and Jeannie, were 2 years apart. Then there was a 4-year gap before I was born. And then after me, there was another 4-year gap before my younger brother was born, and then everybody else was 2 years apart. Well, what that meant was that in this family of 7 kids, I was sort of an outsider because I was too young to play with the older kids and too old to play with the younger ones. And what that did is it turned me into an observer more than a participant. And being an observer is an essential part of being a writer. In Bisbee, Arizona, I attended Greenway School. In 2nd grade, the principal, Mr. Nadolsky, sent me, there were 2 choices of 2nd grade teachers, Mrs. Barker or Mrs. Spangler. And fortunately for all of us, Mr. Nadolsky sent me to Mrs. Spangler's class because in her classroom, over under the windows, there were shelves that were stocked with books. And if you finished your work early, you could leave your desk, go to those shelves, and bring a book back to your desk to read it. And it was among those books that I encountered the world of Oz and all those books written by Frank Baum. Not just The Wizard of Oz with Dorothy and the Ruby Slippers, but all of those other Oz books as well. When I read those books, I didn't want to be a wizard when I grew up. I didn't want to be Dorothy and run around in ruby slippers. What I was fascinated by was Frank Baum standing behind the words, because as soon as I realized that a living, breathing person put those words on the pages, that's what I wanted to be and do. So I grew up. I won a scholarship to the University of Arizona. Because I wanted to be a writer, I enrolled as an English major. In my junior year, when it was time for the upper division classes, I wanted to enroll in the creative writing class, and the professor said, "You're a girl." And I said, "So?" He said, "Girls become teachers or nurses, boys become writers," and he wouldn't let me into his class. So I became a teacher, and then I became a librarian. I actually married a guy who was allowed in that creative writing class that was closed to me. He passed the class, got a good grade. He never published anything, but that didn't keep him from telling me there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it. Well, it turns out he was wrong about that. He died at age 42 of chronic alcoholism. A year and a half after I divorced him, he was dead of booze. Both he and the creative writing professor were dead long before my first book was published in 1985. But I always imagine that every time one of my books hits the New York Times bestseller list, that those 2 guys are spinning in their respective graves. You know, I do carry a grudge, actually. And in my first hardback, my first non-Bowman book, the first Walker family book called Hour of the Hunter, you will find that the main protagonist, Diana Ladd, is a teacher on the reservation, but she always wanted to be a writer. Like me, she had a husband who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to her. Her husband is dead at the beginning of the book. And as for the crazed killer, he turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. That was my first experience with writerly revenge. And um, here's an idea. If you have friends or relations who are embarking on careers of being mystery writers, do not make them mad, because we have our ways of getting even. I said, I became, I taught, I graduated with a teaching degree in English because I wasn't allowed in creative writing. So I taught high school English in Tucson for 2 years. And when I didn't care for that very much, I got a master's degree in library science and spent 5 years as a K through 12 librarian on the reservation. And I told 26 stories a week in K through 6 classrooms. And some of the stories were the ones we all know. Little Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, Molly Whuppie, The Little Engine That Could, Make Way for Ducklings, all of those. But I also learned and told the stories of the Tohono O'odham people, the desert people. And those, by the way, those are winter telling tales. Those stories are only to be told between the middle of March, or the middle of November and the middle of March, because the belief is that if you tell those stories when the snakes and lizards are out, if a snake or lizard overhears the story, they can swallow the storyteller's luck and bring them harm. Well, when I first got to the reservation, I didn't know that. So I told one of the Toy stories. Toy is the Tohono O'odham's spirit of goodness. I told one of those stories in April. And when I came back to school the next day, the principal called me and said, "Did you tell that such and such a story yesterday?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, I had a parent call in and complain." And they had told the principal just exactly that. So as soon as I learned that was the rule, I have abided by it ever since. But the thing about winter telling tales, storytelling started about the same time the spoken word started, because when we were still hunters and gatherers, huddling for warmth and food around fires in the wilderness, the stories were what you told on those cold winter nights to keep the cold and hunger at bay. And it, it makes sense. You shouldn't be sitting around telling stories when it's spring and summer and you need to be out hunting and gathering. But in this past year with the pandemic, I've been really gratified when I've heard from people who have, in this time of isolation, read for the first time or reread for the second or third time all through my books, because the ancient sacred charge of the storyteller is to beguile the time. So one of the things I learned from the Tohono O'odham rules of storytelling is that a story must end where it begins. Well, in Unfinished Business, by the way, this very simple cover, they say you can't tell a book by its cover. But with this one, you certainly can, because if you look, one of the handcuffs is open and one of them is closed. And when we first meet the character of Mateo Vega at the beginning of this book, he's still a relatively young man, I can say from my ancient, old as dirt time frame. Uh, he was a recent college graduate in computer science 16 years earlier when he was arrested for the murder of his then girlfriend. And although he didn't do it, he was nonetheless arrested and charged, and his public defender convinced him that it was in his best interest to take a guilty plea to second-degree murder rather than go to trial and risk being given a life sentence. So we meet him in the Monroe Correctional Facility here in Western Washington the day before he is to be released after serving 16 years for a crime he did not commit. At the end of this book, you need to know you go straight back to the Monroe Correctional Facility because a story must end where it begins. Now, I've been going sort of nutso this past week because the day before Unfinished Business went on sale, I finished writing the next Beaumont book. It's called Nothing to Lose. And so I sent that manuscript off to my beta readers on Monday and started doing virtual events for Unfinished Business on Tuesday. So when people ask me do I work on more than one book at a time? I'm sure they imagine me writing one book, writing one book, writing one book. That would drive me crazy. But I am often writing one book, promoting another, and editing a third. Well, in this instance, I've been editing and promoting virtually, but in spades. And so there have been times this week when people have asked me questions about about Unfinished Business, and I've had to go groping through what I've just written in Nothing to Lose to answer it. And one woman sent me an email and she said, I just finished your new book and I loved it, and I'm so glad those two little kids are in a safe and healthy environment. And I thought, what little kids? What little kids is she talking about? Well, she was talking about my other new book, Missing and Endangered, which came out in March of this year, the Joanna Brady book. So today, the manuscript went to my editor in New York, completely done with it, all the editing I do before New York gets it yesterday. And so this is the first day when I'm really doing a virtual event without writing on the side. And what am I doing? I'm reading somebody else's book because I can't read other people's books when I'm writing one of my own. When I first began writing, the first book I wrote was a thinly fictionalized version of a true crime story that happened to my first husband and me in Tucson in 1970, where we crossed paths with a serial killer, somebody who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. And 30 minutes after forcing his third victim off the highway at gunpoint, he shot her, raped her in front of her two small children, and left her to die. And half an hour to 45 minutes after that, he gave my husband a ride to our house. We were teaching on the reservation. We lived 30 miles from town in either direction, 2 miles up a dirt road from the highway, 7 miles to the nearest neighbor and/or telephone. And the guy who gave, I had to stay late for a school function. And because we were having company, my husband hitchhiked home after work. And believe me, on the reservation, there's no mass transit. People, even the nuns from Topala would hitchhike back and forth. And so my husband hitchhiked home, and the guy who gave him a ride not only to our turnout, but the 2 miles up the dirt road to our house. And on the way, he said, "You leave your wife out here by herself much?" And my husband said, "Well, she's got the dogs." At that point, he had no idea he was talking to a serial killer. We learned that over the next 2 months. But those words came back to haunt us. The next morning, that evening, after I got home from the school function, we took our company and we drove into Tucson to have dinner. And along the way, we were stopped at a roadblock. And we said, "What's going on?" And the deputy said, "Well, there was a homicide on the reservation." And we said, "Indian or Anglo?" And he said, "Anglo." We said, "Good, it's nobody we know then." So we went to the trading post to get gas. And while my husband was pumping the gas, I went in to pay. And there was a deputy in there, and I overheard him talking to the clerk about a man in a green car and something about two little kids. When I got back out to the car, I reported that conversation to my husband and our company. And a couple miles down the road, my husband said, "A man in a green car, I wonder if that's the guy who gave me a ride home this afternoon." And it turns out it was. We went back to the trading post. We told the deputy who we were, where we lived, that we didn't have a phone. And the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, Jack Lyons, Pima County's chief homicide detective, was at our house, and he interviewed my husband from 6 o'clock in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon. And he arrived so early that I didn't have my contacts in. And so I absorbed that whole interview. When I went to write this book, I could actually remember parts of that interview almost verbatim. And I was fascinated by the way the detective framed the questions that helped my husband recall all kinds of telling details in that vehicle that allowed him to remember and gave the detective things he was able to use to identify the killer. Because of the information my husband provided, within a matter of days, the detective knew who the killer was, but he also realized that he was dealing with a serial killer, someone who killed people at 20 minutes after 2 on the 22nd day of the month. He didn't want to pick the guy up until he had all his investigation ducks in a row. And so on the 20th of July, he took my husband, they went up to San Manuel. My husband identified him as he came off shift. And so my husband rode in the car with Jack and the suspect as they came back into Tucson. And he admitted to having been to our house on 3 separate occasions during that 60 days, and we had been scheduled to be July 22nd. My husband worked construction during the summers. I had a year-round job in the library. And so for probably 40 of those 60 days, I was on the Hill by myself. I wore a loaded weapon. I was fully prepared to use it. Actually, I did use it one day. It was a revolver, and I fired all 6 shots at a rapidly retreating rattlesnake who was still laughing as he went up over the wall and disappeared. But I figured if the killer showed up, he would present a larger target, and I was motivated. I figured, and I decided if it was going, if it came down to being between him or me, it was going to be him. And that was a real benchmark moment for me, because when you make that decision in your soul, between him or me, it's going to be him, you can't unring that bell. You can't take back that decision you've made in your soul. And I think that's part of what makes it possible for me to write police procedurals, even though I've never been a cop. I know what it means to make that kind of life or death decision, that you're going to defend yourself at all costs. So the first book I wrote, By Reason of Insanity, was a very fictionalized, a slightly fictionalized version of that real life story. Because I wasn't allowed in the creative writing class, and nobody ever told me to leave some things out, I put everything in, and the resulting book was 1,400 pages long, which is the length of approximately 3 complete murder mysteries. I found an agent, and I made an appointment to go see her. I showed up at her office with my manuscript in a box, and she looked at me and she looked at the box. She said, "That's your first book?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "It's too long, cut it in half." So I did. I went home and I cut it in half and I brought it back, and she tried to sell it. The editors who turned it down said that the stuff that was fiction was fine and the stuff that was real was unbelievable and would never happen, even though those things already had happened. So my agent suggested that I write something that was entirely fiction. And that's when I sat down to write the first Detective Beaumont book, Until Proven Guilty. I wrote 9 of those before my editor said, "Oh, you remember that book you wrote that nobody ever bought?" Yes, I remember that book. He said, "Well, why don't you rework that one?" And so I said, "Well, okay." So they wanted to buy a book. They gave me a contract. I signed it. They sent me a check. I spent it. They gave me a deadline, but I had a real problem because at that point, the killer from 1970 was still in prison in Florence, Arizona. He's still there now, actually. But they were thinking, he had been a model prisoner, and they were thinking about letting him out. And although my husband was the witness and he was dead, I didn't want to write a book that would cause the killer to come looking for me. And so I didn't have a bad guy to put in the book, which gave me a terrible case of writer's block. It was so serious that that year, when my University of Arizona alumni magazine came, I read the whole thing from color to color. Now that, cover to cover, that's real desperation. And at the very back, there was this little boxed article about how the newly reconstituted creative writing program at the U of A was just going swimmingly. And I said to my second husband, the good one, I graduated from there and I have all of these books out. Maybe they'd like me to come be writer in residence for a semester in the sun. He said, "Call him up, ask him." So I did. I sold life insurance for 10 years. I'm not afraid of making a cold call. So I got the number from information. And when I was finally connected to the director of the creative writing program, I told him who I was and what I did. And didn't they want me to come be writer in residence? And he said to me, and I can still hear his voice as he said this, "Oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction." Well, it was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot, and the crazed killer in Hour of the Hunter turned out to be that former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona. But Beaumont, back to the beginning. I was trying to write a murder mystery set in Seattle. By the way, the agent who didn't sell my first book is still my agent 60 years later. Sometimes beginning writers who are fortunate enough to get an agent for their first manuscript, if the agent can't sell that manuscript, they fire the agent and keep the manuscript. I did the opposite. I kept the agent and dropped the manuscript. And so she's still my agent all these years and all these books later. But she was the one who told me to try writing something entirely fiction. And so in 1982, I spent about 6 months trying to write a Seattle-based murder mystery, and I couldn't get it to move off the dime. Finally, in the spring of '83, I sent my kids to Camp Ocala for spring break, and I decided I would go down to Portland and visit one of my friends from my years in the life insurance business. So I got on the train in the King Street station in Seattle. I boarded it with a stack of blue line notebooks and a fistful of pens. And as the train pulled out of the King Street station, I thought, what would happen if I told this story through the detective's point of view? So I got out a notebook, I got out a pen, and I wrote the words, "She might have been a cute kid once. That was hard to tell now. She was dead." And as soon as I wrote those words, I was on the backside of Magnolia Bluff here in Seattle. I was walking around the crime scene in J.P. Beaumont's shoes. I was seeing what he was seeing. I was hearing what he was hearing. I was hearing what he heard. I was hearing what he said. But I also was hearing what was going on in his head. And J.P. Beaumont and J.A. Jance have been character and author from 1983 until now. That's almost 40 years. So when people ask me, where did Beaumont come from? I tell them, I met him on a train, which sounds sort of Agatha Christie-ish, but that really is where I met him and where I met him as a character. Now, I've written, with the one I just finished, there are now 25 J.P. Beaumont books. I wrote 9 of those, and then when I have a limited attention span, I could never be Sue Grafton because I could never set out to write that many books about a single character in a row. Of course, I've now written 25 books with J.P. Beaumont, but I had to take a break. And so my breaks are, I wrote the first Walker family book, Hour of the Hunter. And when I went back to Beaumont, he was fun again. So then my editor suggested I create another character and so I'd be able to alternate. And that's where Joanna Brady came from. When I started writing about Beaumont, he was a middle-aged male homicide cop. I've never been I've been middle-aged, but I haven't been either of the other two. So I thought, okay, how about if I had a female protagonist? I was brand new to Seattle and I had to do a lot of research because J.P. Beaumont was a Seattle native. So I thought, why don't I set the book in a place I know well? And I grew up in Cochise County. So I had a locale, I had a character. As I said, the Beaumont books are written in this first person. And that requires a great deal of focus and discipline, writing, because the reader only knows what that main character has seen, done, heard, said, or thought. And I thought, well, when I wrote that first Walker family book, I sort of went a little nuts. And that's told from 7 or 8 different points of view with a rubber band timeline that goes back and forth over about 70 years. And after writing all those Beaumont books, writing that was sort of like going on vacation. So I decided I would write the Joanna Brady books and ultimately the Allie Reynolds books in the third person as opposed to the first. Allie Reynolds came about a decade after Joanna Brady when I was tired of everybody. And my editor said, well, why don't you write something else? It can be a new character, old character, set it wherever you like. Just have it here by the 1st of January, and we'll publish it as an original paperback. So I signed a contract. They sent me a check. I spent it. They gave me a deadline because that was in May, and I figured write a book between May and January. I can do that. But then, after I spent the money, May and June passed, June and July passed, August and September passed, and suddenly here it was, the middle of October, and I had no idea who was going to be in this book that was supposed to be in New York by the 1st of January. At that point, we were in Tucson, and when I had a case of writer's block, what I did was watch the news compulsively. I stopped doing that. Last year, all the news was so bad that I just gave up news. Now what I do when I have writer's block is I walk. I started walking 5 years ago. I walk my 10,000 plus steps every day. And I just crossed the 12.2 million step mark. I've walked over 5,000 miles, which for the girl least likely to ever be athletic in grade school and high school is pretty amazing that I walk every day. But at that point, what I was doing was watching the news. So one Thursday in October, it was 12 o'clock, so I turned on the noon news, and Patty Weiss, my favorite Tucson newscaster, was on the air. Patty started in Tucson News when she was still a student at the University of Arizona. By this time, she was in her early 50s. So I watched the noon news, and that evening at 5 o'clock, when 5 o'clock came around, it was time for the evening news. I still had writer's block, so I turned the news back on, and Patty Weiss was nowhere to be seen. They didn't say she was on assignment. They didn't say she was on vacation. She had just vanished off the face of the earth. Over the next couple of days, the other news outlets in town let it be known that between the new news and the 5 o'clock news, Patty Weiss's new news director had come to her desk, told her she was too old to be on TV, and escorted her from the building. Well, I already told you, it's a bad idea to make Mr. Rogers mad. And within a matter of hours after finding out what happened to Patty Weiss, I was writing about somebody being named Allie Reynolds being yanked off her news anchor desk in California. And when her marriage blows up at the same time, she ends up going back home to her hometown in Arizona, Sedona, Arizona, to sort of duct tape her life back together. And in that way, Allie Reynolds and I are a lot alike, because after I divorced my first husband in 1980, between then and the time he died a year and a half later, I knew that if he asked me to take him back, I would. So I pulled up stakes. I loaded my kids into the car. loaded all of our worldly goods into a U-Haul trailer, hooked it to my 78 Cutlass Supreme that my then husband said I never should have bought and would never be able to pay for. And off we came to Seattle. So I came to Seattle and reinvented myself in much the same way Allie Reynolds reinvented herself when she came home to Sedona. The 5 years I spent in working in the insurance industry in Phoenix, those were really, really tough years. If you've been in any kind of addictive situation where you're involved with either a drug addict or an alcoholic, those there's an amount of isolation that is just it's impossible to comprehend. And if you if you happen to encounter my book of poetry after the fire, those those poems were written when I was living through that very dark time. It was a time when I wasn't supposed to be a writer. And so in the evenings when my husband was passed out cold, I would sit at the dining room table and jot off these little pieces of poetry. And it's a book, it's in print, it's available right now. And the title poem goes, I have touched the fire. It burned me, but I knew I lived. It seared me, but it made me whole. He called me. I went gladly, though I saw the rocks, fell laughing through the singeing air. I have known the fire. I'll live with nothing rather than with less. The flame is out. There's nothing left but ash. That little book is a treasure. When I was living at that point of my life, I thought I was the only one. Uh, Friends and family sort of drift away because they don't want to have to deal with all that mess. And it's terribly isolating. And when that book lands in the hands of someone who is in that situation and they find out they're not alone, the emails I get in response to that book really touch my heart because I know that that book has been given to them and it's serving as a lifeline. But as I said, those years in Phoenix were so tough, so terribly tough. And I got up here, I quit the insurance business, I started writing, and my life changed. In 1986, I went back to Phoenix and I went to see all of those people I had worked with for all of those years, and none of them recognized me because they had never heard me laugh and they had never seen me smile. So when I fly in and out of Seattle, whenever I see the Seattle skyline, I'm always thankful because Seattle gave me back my laughter and my smile. When I started writing Unfinished Business, I knew right off the bat that Mateo Vega was innocent. And what I wanted for him was for him to be exonerated. But that meant somebody had to reinvestigate the homicide for which he went to prison. Well, Beaumont started out as a middle-aged homicide detective in Seattle. I grew up reading the John D. MacDonald books. And I loved Travis McGee, but Travis McGee never changed. He always lived on busted flush. He always fell for the next pretty girl who showed up. And she was always trouble. Did he learn any lessons from that? No, he did not. And so when I started writing, I decided I was going to make Beaumont age over the years. And so and so he has changed. When I started writing about him, as I said, I was writing about him in the first person, and he was a cop, but he couldn't work all the time, and so I had to I had to have him have something to do that when he wasn't at work. So you don't have to have a creative writing class to know you should write what you know. And at that point in my life, I happened to know a lot about drinking. So I had Bo do the same kind of drinking I had lived with for all those years. I was signing the fourth book, a book called Taking the Fifth. I should have named the fifth book that, it would be easier to remember the order. I was down in Portland outside B. Dalton's bookstore, and a lady came up to the table. I had my book spread out on a little card table, and a lady came up and she said, "You know, Bo drinks every day. He has a drink of choice, and it's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem?" And I said, "You know, these are books." But over that set of signings, 6 people asked me the same question. And I finally realized they were right. My readers were right. I had written that into the background without really thinking about it so accurately that my readers could see Bo had a real problem, even though I couldn't. So in that was book number 4. In book number 7, he has his first blackout. In book number 8, he's in treatment. And I've just finished writing book number 25. So he's been in recovery a lot longer than he was drinking. And I still have fans who say they liked him better when he was a drunk. I worry about them. But again, through the magic of storytelling, people have been able to see their own addiction problems in a way that having their wife telling them they were drinking too much didn't work. The storyteller telling has gotten behind that denial, and it has helped lead others to sobriety as well. Again, just like after the fire, that when I hear those stories, it really means a lot to me. People have asked me, well, how do you make that Beaumont character? How do you write through a male point of view? Well, I spent 18 years of my life trying to figure out what made the guys in the bars so much more interesting to my husband than I was. So I went to the bars with him. I listened how those people talked. I tried to understand what made them tick. And when it comes time to write a male point of view, I just send my head back to those bars and I write away. And how can I do that? Because I was the third one of the first batch in an 8-year gap, and I got turned into an observer. But the other thing is, that first husband, being married to an alcoholic shouldn't necessarily be a path to success, a recipe for success as a writer. But the truth is, although that guy was really a dead loss as far as husband material, from the point of view of someone who wanted to be a mystery writer, the guy was a gold mine. So no regrets, no regrets about that first life, because I learned so much that I would never have been able to learn otherwise. There's nothing like standing behind a tree, dodging bullets from a gunfight in a dive bar in Hammond, Indiana, to, to teach you something about real life. So when I started writing Unfinished Business, Beaumont has gone from being a middle-aged homicide cop to being a retired homicide cop who works for volunteer cold case organizations in retirement. And uh, when I started writing Unfinished Business and realized that Mateo Vega's girlfriend's homicide needed to be reinvented, I said, no, wait a minute. I have a perfectly good cold case guy working right here in Seattle. Why not use him? Well, there was a very good reason. The Beaumonts, the Bradys, and the Walkers belong to HarperCollins. Allie Reynolds belongs to Simon and Schuster. And those two publishing houses are sort of like the Capulets and the Montagues in Romeo and Juliet. They know about each other and they do not get along. But I was able to arrange a peace treaty with my HarperCollins editor that Bo could appear as a guest in this Allie Reynolds book. Because the Allie Reynolds books are written in the third person, I figured Bo's part would be written in the third person as well. But when he turned up, he wouldn't do anything in the third person. The only way I could get him to do something was in the way I've always known him, in his first person voice. So I finally gave up, let him have it his way, and wrote the book that way. I sent it to my new editor at Simon and Schuster. She had never read a Beaumont book. So when she got to that part of the book, she found this disturbing, this change from everybody else in third person to Beaumont's first person. So she went through the book and changed all of his parts to third person. Well, I thought, okay, if somebody else does it, maybe it'll be okay. After all, they don't let surgeons operate on their own family members. But then she sent the line edited manuscript back to me. And when I encountered that third person J.P. Beaumont, all of a sudden, the character I had known all these years was gone, and left in his place was this cardboard cutout. I'm reminded of a paper doll Prince Philip from my Queen Elizabeth coronation paper doll collection. Yes, I am that old. And he was dead on arrival. So I called my editor and I said, okay, J.P. Beaumont in the third person doesn't work. I'm putting him back in first, and it's either my way or the highway. And so they said, okay, we'll do it your way. So Bo shows up in all his 70-something curmudgeonly glory in this book. There are 3 lines of stories in 3 strings of storyline in this book. There's Mateo Vega's story. There's the story of a really scary guy named Harvey Broomy McCluskey, who's a serial killer. And because it's in the third person, we meet Broomy McCluskey when he is a 15-year-old in the process of murdering his mother and getting away with it. So that when he shows up as a renter in Allie Reynolds' building, and she starts eviction proceedings because he isn't paying his rent, the reader knows how dangerous Harvey McCluskey is, but Allie Reynolds has no idea. And then there's a story about Allie's family life. And I've heard from people. I know that part of the story is touching people who have dealt with those kinds of issues. But I believe that part of the story also gives this murder mystery a moment of real grace.